Thank you, Donna. It's great pleasure to be with you on this beautiful day. Thank you all for taking time out on Inauguration Day to be part of this uh, conversation about seabirds. It really is my life story. I'm going to share with you in the next 45 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. I've had a very focused career learning about seabirds, and much of that time has been spent in the great state of Maine during the summers, and the things that I've learned along the way, a few of them. What brought me to Maine originally was this beautiful island called Hog Island in Muscongas Bay. Midcoast Maine, Hog Island has been operated by National Audubon since 1936 as a learning center for adults. It's a place that brought me back each year, first as a bird life instructor, later as a researcher, later as the director of the place. And over those years, I've had some time to think about how the ecology of the area works and how people have been part of it. It's interesting for me to look back on nearly 50 years of working with seabirds on this coast, 50 years of being associated with Hog Island Audubon Camp. Some of the things that I did not know at the beginning uh, have turned out to be the cornerstones of what we now know and what we now think about the ecology of the area. Now, when I first came to Hog Island as a bird life instructor, I was surrounded by eager learners, and I was sharing pretty much the perspective of what I was seeing at the time. I was seeing groups of birds like black guillemots, which I have in my hand here, and found myself interpreting them based upon the bits of the ecology that were obvious to me at the time, and about some of the history that I had learned along the way. For example, almost all the birds in Maine had been shot for food or for feathers by 1900. In fact, almost all the seabirds had disappeared. And the habitat on the mainland had been completely changed. There were people living on almost all the islands, including the most outermost islands, like Matinicus Rock. They lived there year round to protect the shipping industry and the fishermen that were along the coast. Those were all parts of the story that I knew. And I knew that this had had a terrible effect on birds like puffins, and that Matinicus Rock was the last place where puffins had made a stand. Only 2 birds were left in the whole state of Maine on Matinicus Rock by 1900. That bit of information I knew. And I also knew that I was surrounded as a naturalist in Muscongas Bay by gulls, beautiful herring gulls. And we would go out to the bird islands and we'd land there and we'd be able to see the little gull chicks with their parents. Not just a few of them, but thousands of them. Almost every island along the Maine coast in the late 1960s was crowded with gulls, herring gulls, and great blackback gulls. The puffins were gone, except from a small colony on Matinicus Rock. And the terns were largely gone as well. One thing I didn't realize at the time was that the reason that none of those birds came back on their own, even though they were all protected by protective laws like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, was the fact that the gulls were such a success on this coast that they were preventing other birds from naturally recolonizing. Something else that I couldn't see at the time was that what was happening under the water was also changing. People had caught most of the herring along the coast, and they were continuing to capture them. And people had also blocked the rivers where gulls and other seabirds went to eat food, like these alewives. I had not realized it when I was a bird life instructor on Hog Island that over 200 dams had been built along just the Penobscot River drainage. Other rivers had the same kind of blockage. And just as we know that blocking our arteries in our body will eventually kill us, so too were we blocking the arteries of all the rivers in Maine. And this was having an enormous effect on the flow of fish out of those lakes and rivers into the ocean. The gulls that I saw, there was a dark side to this. The gulls were thriving in part, had shifted from eating natural foods like alewives and other kinds of herring. Even though they were called herring gulls, they had become garbage gulls. Most of their food was coming from open landfills along the coast or from feeding behind factory ships that were taking out the rest of the herring and using the herring for bait for capturing lobsters. That's where the gulls were finding a living, not in the rivers, not in the open oceans, but at the hand of humans that were providing excess food. And the reason that part of the reason that puffins and terns had not come back was the fact that nothing people were doing was helping them. We were inadvertently helping the adaptive gulls. Of course, the gulls are native birds, but before their population had been kept in check by predators and and um, by food. Another thing that was happening along the coast was that um, there was just the beginning in the late 60s of a program to bring back some of the rare endangered birds of prey. I was a graduate student at the time at Cornell University, and by coincidence happened to be there when the Peregrine Fund was starting to reintroduce peregrine falcons to the Maine coast. I didn't realize what an irony it would be later, some 50 years later, that the success with that restoration program and the success with the restoration of bald eagles would become part of the new problem of managing Maine's rare and endangered seabirds. Bald eagles and peregrines had disappeared from the Maine coast, but they were back and returning more and more. When I began thinking about how to bring puffins back to the coast of Maine, I hadn't really had all this backstory about the loss of the fisheries, about the blockage of the rivers, and about the recovery of predators, including mammals like mink that can swim up to several miles of open ocean, sniffing out seabird colonies, invading them, and chasing the seabirds off. These unseen predators, I believe, had a huge effect in preventing the natural recovery of puffins and terns from islands. And so, as I look back at the very beginning of Project Puffin, and an idea that is really nothing short of naive, I find myself kind of humbled the fact that I was able to start this project and see it through over all these years. A project that started on a little island called Eastern Egg Rock, located about 8 miles from the Audubon camp on Hog Island. Now, Egg Rock, as you might guess, with a name like Egg Rock, is a place where seabirds have bred. They were breeding there when islands got their name. And nearby, there was a Western Egg Rock and a Little Egg Rock, and the whole coast is scattered with islands called Egg Rocks because that's where people used to go to take the eggs of seabirds. When I started visiting Eastern Egg Rock in the late 60s with the Hog Island Audubon camp, it was a gull colony, just like almost every other colony on the coast. But I could imagine what it must have been like when puffins nested there under the boulders around the island. I had seen puffins on the Canadian border before, and I knew what a loss this was. And as a birdlife instructor with a growing knowledge of the history of this area and the bird history of this area, I thought it was a tremendous loss that I couldn't show people puffins on this historic nesting island. And so I began sort of hatching this plan, reading about puffins, talking to people who knew something about them to see whether there was some possible way that I could help to bring them back to the island. Now, realize at that point in time, that was not a common way of thinking about seabirds. Usually, people would, if they did anything at all, they'd put a sign up on a post and say, "Do not land on this island," thinking disturbance was the big problem. But I knew that with even rarer birds like peregrines, there was an active management going on, but there was very little funding and there was very little support for trying to do something with puffins. And when I approached this idea to some ornithologists, I would pretty much hear, let nature take its course. They'll come back when they're ready, if they're going to come back. And besides, there's millions of puffins in Iceland. If anybody wants to see puffins, let them go to Iceland. Why bother with birds here? And yet I knew that the reason the puffins disappeared off Egg Rock and off other islands along the Maine coast because people hunted them for food and feathers, and they took them all. And the puffins usually returned to the island where they hatched. Once the natural native colony was gone, there was no breeders left to repopulate that island. And recolonization of birds, seabirds onto islands is a slow, very slow process. Well, I began trying to read about everything I could about puffins. I became, well, perhaps I was a bit obsessed about this idea in retrospect. And I kept thinking about it. And in my mind, I could just see those puffins on those boulders again. And in my reading, I realized that young puffins, and there's only one chick, only one egg, only one chick per pair per year. Young puffins learn where home is sometime after they hatch. They head out to sea and they eventually come back to either the place they left from as a chick or they come back there or they visit other islands nearby. And so I came up with this idea that what if I could find some puffin chicks, move them to Eastern Egg Rock where they nested long ago, feed them, and let them head off to sea by themselves. I knew that puffin parents didn't head off to sea with chicks, and the natural way of a young puffin is to head off by itself, somehow with a map, somehow uh, with his bags packed to return when it was old enough. And so, after several years of trying to get the necessary permits, I eventually got a permit from the Canadian Wildlife Service to fly to Newfoundland, where there are still huge colonies of puffins, and to collect the first few puffins to bring back to Maine. Our first permits were only for 5 chicks, but those 5 chicks had to survive and they had to demonstrate they could live in order to get more. And so the plan was to fly from Maine to Newfoundland to an island called Great Island and to fly the birds back to the coast of Maine as fast as possible. And we did that. We collected them in the morning on Great Island, Newfoundland, and by dark of the same day, we were rowing them ashore onto onto Eastern Egg Rock. And here I am back in those early days with some of the first of the chicks, tucking them into a hand-dug burrow where we would feed them for about the next month. It was quite an adventure living on a treeless, windswept island. On a calm day, it seemed like a pleasant enough place. But of course, the coast of Maine can be an very extreme environment. And we soon found that the winds would whip and the rains would pour and the storms would rip across our little outpost. Yet still, I was joined by other young biologists that wanted to see this through. And they believed in this idea, even though I still had to prove it. On the island, The biologists, the young college age interns, took the place of the parents for about a month, hand fed the little chicks until the chicks were old enough to come out and look around. And hopefully, they would see then that this was Eastern egg rock, and they would somehow magically make that map in their minds and head off to sea and then return. Now, nobody knew exactly how long it was that Puffin spent at sea. And one of the things that we learned through this project was that they spend the first 2 years of their life and maybe more at sea. And they don't breed till they're usually 5 years old, and sometimes not till they're older. Well, this is what a puffin chick looks like when it heads to sea, all dressed for life on the ocean. There's no big colorful beak. It doesn't need it. That's a courtship adornment. The face is dark gray. It's all dressed for business. It's dressed for survival. And they head off by themselves. And that's what happened to our little chicks that we brought from Newfoundland. It turns out they are very strong birds, very robust survivors. And they would head off to sea by themselves and they would live on the open oceans. Years went by without seeing them, however. But eventually, I came on the idea of putting up decoys to help lure them back. And people often ask me, how did you come up with that idea of using decoys for the first time? And this is the first example of when I realized the value of being able to try as best we can as a human to try to think like a puffin. Realize this, that a puffin is a colonial bird. They don't live by themselves. And what is our little birds to think when they would come back to Egg Rock where their ancestors nested 100 years ago and there's no one there? Perhaps our translocated birds were coming back, just shy about coming ashore. I think that might be the case because in 1977, when I first put up the first puffin decoys, almost within the same day, a puffin showed up, circled the island, eventually landed, and walked up and looked at the decoys close up and pecked at the decoys, tried to get them to move. And you may wonder, well, how bright could they be? Well, I think they're pretty bright, really. I think they learned quickly that this was not the real thing. And then they flew away. But I saw their legs were banded, and that proved to me that these, in fact, were the very young fuzzy chicks that I brought from Newfoundland. This was now 8 years since the beginning of this project, when I first started thinking about this. Well, to try to keep those first arriving puffins there, I had to again try to think like a bird. And I tried to make an animated decoy by using mirrors. It's well known that birds are attracted to reflective surfaces. Sometimes cardinals will flutter at a window or at a shiny hubcap. And puffins, too, are attracted to their own reflections, fooled because of the movement and by seeing another puffin somehow inside of this box. But they figure that out, too, because puffins are smart. And what happened as time went by was that more and more puffins each year would come back. We translocated about 1,000 puffin chicks from Great Island, Newfoundland to Eastern Egg Rock. Almost all of those survived. About 20% of them eventually showed up either at Egg Rock or elsewhere. And what we saw was that they were landing with the decoys, but they preferred landing with each other. So the decoys were kind of like the initial hub of recolonization. And then later they found each other at the decoys. And the longer they stayed, the better. And by 1980, they were going down under the boulders looking around. And I was very excited. Now it was 7 years since I had moved the first puffin chicks to the island, but still none of them were nesting. And I was getting a lot of criticism from people who were saying, oh, this is never going to work. What a waste of time and money. Why stick with this? And I figured from the beginning, if I did not stick with this, no one would probably try anything like this later, because after all, I had tried for so many years and failed if I had quit when I did. So I kept at it. But what I was really looking for was a puffin flying with fish in its beak. If I could just see that, it would mean that there was a chick under the boulders. And so, imagine my excitement on the 4th of July in 1981, 8 years after we had moved the first puffin chick, when a puffin, in fact, came flying in with its beak loaded with fish, and even better, it was banded, proving it was one of my birds brought to Egg Rock from Newfoundland, and it dropped on the rocks, disappeared under the boulders, and came out without the fish. And although we didn't see the chick, we knew there was one there because that's what puffins do. In the years that have followed this discovery, we have kept researchers on Eastern Egg Rock every year. And that's why I can share this story, this longer story, and how for about 15 years, the population stayed under 20 pairs of puffins. But in about the year 2000, the population began to increase, and it's been on an increase ever since. We're up to about 188 pairs, give or take a few pairs, as of last year. And that's great news. We have not had to bring more puffins to Egg Rock since 1986. That was the last year. And all of this growth in recent years is from birds produced on the island that have come back, or from other islands that have come back. Because the more puffins you get, the more attractive the island is to other puffins that are prospecting, that is, searching for their future home. And to prove that this was not just a one-off kind of success story, we started a second puffin restoration project on Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge in Outer Penobscot Bay in 1984, and moved another 1,000 puffin chicks there over the next several years. And in fact, recolonized that island also, and it now has hundreds of pairs of puffins. It's the largest colony of puffins in Maine. The same hard, laborious work of going to Newfoundland, collecting the chicks, hand rearing them was needed. And it also took 8 years to get the first puffins to breed on Seal Island. But since then, we've seen this colony increase, and we've seen that it is possible to replicate the process. Now, I think the big question that I'm often asked, maybe the most important question, is are these colonies really sustainable? If you have to keep people living on them year after year, is that a sustainable process? Is it more like stocking a fish pond and then fishing it out? Well, we're no longer bringing in young puffins, and these colonies are producing growing populations. But if we did not have our young biologists still living on the islands to discourage the predators, the gulls and now eagles and peregrines, I don't think these small colonies would last for long. And if that's true, how were they ever sustainable? What's different now than long ago, before European colonization, when people started overfishing and blocking rivers and doing all the things that they've done? How did it all work? Well, again, I put my hat on and I started trying to think like a bird. I started trying to imagine what it was like. One thing I realized was that these puffins used to live under an umbrella of aggressive terns, Arctic terns especially. They nest on the surface and they chase away eagles and gulls. So if I could just bring back the terns, they could then maybe be the caretakers, and we could all pack up and be done with this and call this an end. So we set out to create tern decoys using some of the same methods that we had done with puffins. But terns are very noisy, so we put out tern recordings as well. We played the colony sounds of terns and discovered that male terns will sometimes try and feed the decoys. Amazing. Who would have thought? And they'll sometimes try and chase them away. Totally fooled. And even a stylized decoy, I call this my essence of tern decoy. Even a stylized decoy, just a piece of 2x4 painted, will elicit the same kind of behaviors. No one had ever tried this before. But most important, the terns would lay their eggs right next to the decoys. This business of trying to start a colony using decoys and sound recordings and mirrors now has a name called social attraction. And I think that's probably the most important thing we've discovered in our whole process. It all comes from trying to think like a bird. That these birds, the first colonists on an island, are shy. It's dangerous to be the first colonist. It makes much more sense to breed with others of your kind. And those successes off the Maine coast, then I found just because it was a good, simple idea, had value globally. And other people were learning about this project and they wanted to try it as well. So I call this chapter of our story that Project Puffin goes global. The island hatched on the Maine coast, but now look at it. All these red spots are places around the world that are using these same methods, either translocation of seabird chicks or decoys, sometimes mixed with sound recordings, sometimes mixed with using reflective mirrors. But behind every one of those red dots, there is a bird hero that is out there trying to save a species. And that's very heartening news that there are so many people that care. To help this process of attracting birds to safe nesting islands, we built a made in Maine decoy factory. This is in Bremen. This is Sue Schubel, the manager of our decoy factory, surrounded by decoys of great crested terns for a project in Korea that she was working on at the moment. And she's got some common myrrh eggs for another project that she's working on. And these decoys now are being shipped to many of those places around the world, along with sound equipment and along with mirrors, because all of these tools in the right place can really help to make a difference. I want to just share a few of these exciting projects with you, because to me, this is some of the most important things we've learned over the years. This story about the short-tailed albatross is especially interesting. It's a species that is only known to breed in Japan and islands near south of Japan. The primary place for this bird, where it survived its bottleneck after decades of hunting for the feather industry, was on an island called Torishima, or Bird Island in Japan. Feather hunters killed almost all these birds. It's thought that they killed several million albatross for the feather trade in Japan, about the same time that we were killing puffins off the Maine coast. These feathers were used for stuffing mattresses and pillows. And what a tragedy it was. This magnificent golden-headed albatross slaughtered for its feathers. The good news is that there are Japanese biologists that care as much about saving seabirds as we care about saving puffins on the Maine coast. This is Dr. Hasegawa in Japan setting out life-size, very realistic decoys on Torishima Island, where he's trying to attract them to start a new subcolony. And he and others were also involved with creating a new colony off of Torishima Island on Mukajima Island. This ambitious project helicoptered young albatross chicks. There's one big fat one in the foreground here. Surround them with decoys on the restoration site, which is a non-volcanic island. These young Albatross were hand fed, permitted to fledge, and now they're coming back and nesting on this island and other nearby non-volcanic islands. This gives the birds some safety in case that big volcano erupts again. Another project, the most recent project that we've become involved as an advisor, is in China. This is the rarest seabird in the world, the Chinese crested tern. It was thought to be extinct for almost 70 years until it was found nesting on a couple of small islets in China that were not protected. And so to protect them from egg poachers and other problems, young Chinese biologists first came to Maine to learn some of our methods. Then they went back home and they set up decoys and solar panels and audio equipment to try to attract the terns to a sanctuary, much as we did on Eastern Egg Rock. If you look carefully in this picture, you see that some of these terns are sitting on blocks of cement. These are decoys. But most of these birds are not sitting on anything. These are great crested terns. And the great crested tern is very common, but they help to attract the endangered Chinese crested terns, identified by their orange beak with a black tip. Well, let's just watch how this works. These are the decoys. This is the real tern. And notice that he's buried in that decoy. So interested, it sits up on top of it. Eventually, it helps to attract another mate just by staying put on the island. And you can see this story had a happy ending. There's the pair of Chinese crested terns, again identified by their crest, the orange bill, and their little white fluffy chick, one of the rarest of all creatures on our planet. But it now has a safe home on a Chinese wildlife sanctuary. I'm pretty proud of that little chick because it might not be there if we hadn't learned how to start seabird colonies on the Maine coast, on the other half of the world away. Well, we continue to keep our interns on Eastern Egg Rock and on 6 other seabird nesting colonies along the Maine coast every summer, not just to chase off predators, but that is important, because the gulls and the eagles won't land as long as we're there. But while we are there, we have an opportunity to learn some other things. And I want to just share some of this because it relates to climate change and fisheries. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than any other marine area in the world. And our little cabin on Eastern Egg Rock, which once housed the interns that looked after the Newfoundland chicks, now houses researchers that are studying climate change by watching the foods that the puffins and terns are bringing back to their chicks. If you've ever been on a puffin watching trip around Egg Rock, and I hope you'll do it if you haven't, you've probably noticed the little boxes on the island, 3-foot square boxes. Our interns spend about 6 hours of every day inside these boxes where they have amazing views. Inside the boxes, they can see what's in the beaks of the puffins, because the puffins are tame. They are not afraid of people at all, and they'll land right outside of the observation blinds. And with binoculars, you can see the kinds of fish in the beaks, and you can also read the leg bands even on the birds. And we've determined that some of these foods are better than other kinds of foods. The best food of all, I call it a superfood, is the Atlantic herring. This is what puffins probably ate long ago on the Maine coast when there was still abundant herring, but it's a rare item now in the puffin's diet. More common, in fact, the staple of their diet, it's another good food, It's called the white hake. It's a member of the cod family that grows to be 30 or more pounds, but these are young of the year, little white hake. A puffin can bring back 20 or more in a feeding. They do this by grabbing the first fish, holding it up against the roof of their beak with their tongue, and then dropping the lower mandible to snatch up the next one. And they're doing all this while they're flying through the water, diving 50 or more feet under the water, chasing little fish. It's amazing. When a puffin's underwater, it's like a fish underwater. But all the food is not so good for the young puffins, especially the big butterfish. And the reason the problem is with the butterfish is that it's too big for the chicks to swallow. I'm excited to say, however, that there are some new foods that are showing up in the diet of young puffins these days. The last few years, the puffin chicks have been raised largely on a new food. It's haddock, the same haddock that people enjoy in their fish and chips. Haddock is a recovering fishery, and it's proof that smart fisheries management is good for people and for seabirds. And the presence of the resurgence of haddock in the bird's diet is going to help them adapt to climate change. The oceans are getting warmer, and how is this going to affect the seabirds? Well, this graph helps to focus on one individual puffin chick. On Seal Island, we have a camera inside of a burrow, and that camera focuses on one chick each year. And if you look at this graph, you see an interesting thing. This is a little puffin chick, Grace. And these are the numbers of feedings that little chick was getting. Normally, they would start out being fed maybe 4 or so a day, and the number would increase. But this line is water temperature. And notice how as water temperature over the summer increased, the number of feedings decreased. This is because as the surface of the water warms, the little fish go too deep for puffins to catch them, or they swim too far from the island, because fish need to maintain and can maintain the water temperature they're in by going either deeper where it's colder or further offshore where it's colder, both of which are a problem for parent puffins. As water temperature declined after this heat wave of late July, early August, the number of feedings increased again. So these are ways the puffin is showing us the impact of warming water. If the water stayed this temperature all summer long, the puffin parents probably wouldn't be able to bring home enough food of any kind for their chicks. So during that heat wave, our little puffin Grace was weak and emaciated, and her down was hiding kind of like her scrawny body shape. But as soon as the heat wave passed and the feedings resumed, the same bird, just about 2 weeks later, started all of a sudden getting fat and ready to fledge. The interesting thing to me is that the puffin parents stayed about 3 weeks longer that year in order to make sure that puffin Grace and other puffins fledged successfully. So these are little stories that we're able to see by living on the island. How long will we need to live on the island? Well, I can tell you this, that putting a sign up to tell people not to land is not going to save the seabirds, because the gulls and the eagles will come anyways. The terns and the puffins learn that the researchers are their friends, and the researchers are gathering the data that we need to help to save these seabirds. And it's helping to train a new generation of young biologists that care, that go off to start their own projects around the world and in North America, not just with seabirds, but all kinds of wildlife. So all of this depends on people caring. And that's why a Project Puffin that I founded back in the late 60s survives in part over some 50 years because people do support this work. It's part of National Audubon Society's science department, but it depends on donations and receipts from things like the Puffin watching tours. If you go on these tours, you can get close to the birds and know that some of um, your ticket fee will help to keep the researchers on the island, Booth Bay and New Harbor. And even last summer during the pandemic, they were running, and they'll be running again this year. People everywhere have an opportunity to learn about the puffins, to see the chick underground, to see the puffins above ground by visiting explore.org, which is a live streaming wildlife camera. And they can visit Hog Island for these 5-day residential programs that brought me to Maine years ago. If you've never been, you're in for a real treat. And the camp just announced that they will be opening this coming summer with a limited program, but in-person instruction. It's the best way to learn about seabirds and to learn about the natural history of the Maine coast, teens and adults and families. And you may also be interested to know we have a new online course. Yep, you can learn about seabirds in depth, about their biology and their threats and the conservation wonders that are happening. All of this is on the Hog Island website, how to take the course. We are connected, just as these kids are doing in a classroom visit by one of our outreach teachers, to the marine world in ways that are not always so obvious. But when we make one change, something else gets jerked somewhere else. We're part of that food web, and we can make a difference, just as we've demonstrated through Project Puffin, that we can bring the puffins back to Maine and the terns and inspire other people to do similar kinds of things in different places. It's an opportunity, and it's so satisfying. And I hope you'll have a way to connect to what we do. If you're from Maine, it's even easier. If you're not, it's still possible. So thank you for listening to this story, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. As Donna mentioned earlier, just send them in on the chat line, and I'll try to answer them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I do have a few questions that we could use to get the ball rolling.
Okay.
First of all, I wonder, in your puffin population chart, there was a bit of a decline in 2011 and 12. Do you know what caused that change?
Yes, the puffins in 2012 and in 13, those years, that was the first big heat wave that we had on the Maine coast. And it was the record-setting warm temperatures, and that affected everything. The numbers of puffins were breeding on the island were fewer, and their nesting success was the worst ever. We saw that on all the seabird islands. And so, yes, that was our first clue that, oh my gosh, climate change, it caught up with Project Puffin.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Also, when you talk about the predators, the mink, some of the eagles, do your student field personnel, are they ever tempted to interfere? Do you have a discussion or a position on whether they should interfere to protect the chicks or leave nature alone?
So as far as the predators go, the primary thing that happens is that the presence of the interns living on the islands actually is enough to deter most of the predators. Eagles, for example, won't land anywhere near the seabirds as long as they know there's people. But if their people are not there, the eagles will land. In fact, last year, because of the COVID restrictions, we got out to Seal Island 2 weeks later, and a pair of eagles had already built a nest on one of our platforms for an observation blind. If we hadn't come out when we did, those eagles would continue to nest and probably disrupted the whole breeding season, just one pair of eagles.
Just one pair.
So presence of our interns is enough, but if there is a predator on the island, like a mink or something, we do have permits that we can use to trap and remove that predator, because one mink on an island would be enough to also chase off thousands of seabirds.
Thanks, Steve. I have another question about, there is a decoy factory in Raymond. Do they work with you at all?
I'm not sure about what that decoy factory is. Is that, no, I'm not sure. Raymond, Maine?
It is in Maine. It's probably, about an hour or so inland, just about an hour from Portland.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
So-
well, decoys, I don't know what kind of decoys they make, but decoys have been around a long time. And the interesting thing about it is that most of them are used for hunting. Our use of decoys was the first time that decoys were used for conservation, and for starting new seabird colonies. So most decoys, and I'm not sure what kind they make, but if it's waterfowl, it may be for hunting. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I have
wonder-
a question, Donna.
Yes?
I have a question. I think many years ago, I took one of the tours that showed the Matinicus rock with the puffin decoys on them. And we were told on that tour that a lot of the puffins had disappeared because the seagulls were eating their eggs. Is that right?
It's not exactly right. I think that puffins, if that was referring to a time before we started putting researchers out there, it could have been true. Not so much the puffins, but the terns. Gulls were taking a lot of tern eggs on Matinicus Rock until we started putting out our researchers on the island and discourage the gulls by being there.
So
But yes, we do keep it. We do have a team. Matinicus Rock is one of our 7 islands that there's biologists on, usually from mid-May onward throughout the seabird nesting season.
So back when you first started, the disappearance was primarily what you were saying, the lack of food and climate change and people killing them for their feathers.
Initially, it was people killing the seabirds for their meat, for their feathers, meat and eggs. The resurgence of gulls then became so many that the gulls deterred recolonization by other seabirds like puffins and terns.
Thank you.
Steve, I wonder if you could talk about some of the more recent research about puffins spending the winter at sea.
Yes, okay, thank you. For most of our time, it was a mystery where puffins went in the winter. We knew they left the islands almost by the same date every year, by mid-August. They would head off to sea, and then they would show back up again in April, but nobody knew where they were going. And although many seabirds and many kinds of birds have been tracked by using little tracking devices, puffins created a number of problems. They're small, they're lightweight, less under a pound each, and they don't, because they dive to deep depths, the equipment that people would put on them was too heavy or would get waterlogged. So it took the development of little devices called geolocators, so small, so miniature, we could attach them to leg bands. And then we finally discovered that the puffins in Maine fly north, usually first to Canada, sometimes as far north as Labrador. This is in August. They're going north. We think of birds flying south in the fall, but these birds are actually flying north. And we're learning things like this about migration, that there's always full of surprises, big surprises. And then they would turn around and come south to the continental shelf off of Cape Cod and into the Gulf of Maine for the winter. Some of them never leave the Gulf of Maine. They don't do the Canada trip at all, but they stay in the Gulf of Maine. The discovery of the birds on the continental shelf led to support for the movement to start the Marine National Monument that was created offshore. And knowing that the puffins were there added to the long list of other species that were still using that area, which is now an important protected area, the only marine monument on the Atlantic coast.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you for mentioning the puffin cam, because many of us tune in to watch the puffins in the burrows, the puffin chicks. And I think that's a great way of learning more about them, but also becoming attached, caring about that population.
Yes, that's right. I mean, when we identify with one bird, it's powerful. And it can get pretty tense when the parents don't come home with the food. You know, it's not necessarily because they don't care. It's because the water is too warm and they can't find enough food. And to me, it makes climate change very real. We realize this chick is starving because the water is too warm. Otherwise, it's hard to really envision. Climate change is so important, but it's sometimes hard to picture it, the effects.
A little less concrete, that's true. Now, many of us are interested in finding out how we might be able to volunteer at Project Puffin. What do you suggest?
Well, the cameras are a good way to do that for anybody because they do collect data. People can volunteer and they can send in their observations, and that data is useful for learning more about puffins. We don't have very many volunteers on the nesting islands. We do also use volunteers on Hog Island. The Friends of Hog Island is all about volunteers. And there's a website, Friends of Hog Island, if people would like to come to Hog Island and be part of that as a volunteer.
That's great. That's great. Steve, did you, in your research, did you work at all with Roger Tory Peterson, who I think early in his career was involved in some of the Maine Audubon camps?
Yes, Roger Peterson was the first bird life instructor on Hog Island. And later I did get to know him. And I took him out to Eastern Egg Rock for some filming events. And I brought him back too.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Is that there? No, I guess we don't. But I'd like to thank you, Steve, for joining us today and sharing your life's work with us. It's been a great way to spend the afternoon, a very thought-provoking way of thinking about the importance of tenacity and to some degree endurance, observation, all the things that make great wildlife biology, and then sharing those stories with all of us so that we could really understand the impact of all of your work on the Maine environment in general and the global population. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you all for being part of this. Yep.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Yep. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Donna?
Thank you. It was
Thank you.
fabulous. It was so clear.
Thank you.
Daughter,
Thank
daughter
you.
Lisa White was one of your interns. We've
Thank
learned
you.
a lot.
Hey, Donna?